So how can we use evidence-based practice in exercise science and health promotion? Well, what are you going to need first off to do it? First off, we need to start with a positive attitude. I think we need to look at this not as a terrible thing we have to do, but something that's going to help us learn about our field, help us help our clients or our athletes even more than we currently do, and advance our professional standing among our colleagues. So it starts with that positive attitude. We're also going to need our brain. There's going to be a lot of thinking involved in this process. How it applies to your people, what kind of questions do we need to know, what kind of answers do we need to be able to solve this problem, this issue that we have with our clients. We're going to need a computer. Hopefully you have one as cool as this with the pink background and lots of doodads around your desk. But we're going to need a computer because we're going to need to get online. We're going to look for potentially expert opinion online. And I use experts very specifically to make sure they're experts. And then we also need to find literature from peer-reviewed sources to help us answer this question. We need a thinking cap. That's the picture of the guy there with a hat on, because we're going to gather a lot of information. Then we're going to have to think about it and figure out how we can best apply it to our particular situation, to our clients and our patients that we work with. We're going to need to be able to take some measurements, to see if it works, right? We need to look and see, did our intervention have a positive effect? Did it bring about the change we wanted to bring about? That might mean you need a tape measure. It also might mean you need a scale. It might mean you need a survey of happiness. It could be a whole bunch of things, but we're going to need to take some type of measurements and assess something. And then we're going to end up with a positive attitude again, because we're going to have learned some really useful things that are going to make us more confident in our own skills and our ability to help others. And it's going to improve our professional standing with our clients and our colleagues. Specifically, evidence-based practice follows this 5 steps, this 5 A's model. We're going to ask a question. We're going to acquire information. We're going to appraise that information. We're then going to use that information. We're going to apply it to our particular question and our clients, our athletes that we work with. And then we're going to assess the outcomes of that. We're going to assess whether or not our intervention, our new program we've designed or applied to our people is working. It did bring about the change that we wanted to bring about. So evidence-based practice follows these 5 steps. We're going to go over these 5 steps in more detail as we move through these presentations. So specifically, evidence-based practice is going to ask a question. We're going to really spend some time on the question, because we have to create an answerable, researchable question about our clients, the problem that we have with them or the issue, the interventions that we're considering, and what is the outcome that we're attempting to change or improve. So the questions for evidence-based practice are probably the most important part of the whole process. We have to ask a very specific question, and then that will allow us to find the answer to that question. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the ask part. The acquire and appraise part relates to information. We have to search for relevant evidence to our question. Our question is really going to guide how we do that, though. And we have to determine, the appraise part is determine whether the information is of high quality, if it's relevant to our specific population, and if it's valuable to us in making a decision. We then take the information that is good, and we use that information to make a decision for our clients. What is the treatment we're going to use? What is the diet we're going to recommend, etc. Then finally, we have to assess. We have to evaluate the outcome of applying the evidence. So maybe we take a pre-measure on, maybe our goal was to improve sprint speed in a group of athletes. We take, before we do a program, we measure their sprint speed. We gather information, we design an exercise program, we apply that exercise program to these people for 6 weeks, then we reassess and see, did it work? Did it improve their sprint speed over that time period, and so on. So those are the steps in evidence-based practice, and the steps that I want to go over in more detail here so that you understand how to use them. So step 1 is to formulate a question, right? And sometimes these questions just, come to you very easily because you're presented with something new. For example, as an athletic trainer, I worked a lot of football and volleyball, a lot of team sports. Then I had to work with track. And I was presented with an athlete that had shoulder pain, but was a javelin thrower. I had worked with a lot of overhead throwing athletes before, but I hadn't worked with javelin throwers. And the mechanism and the mechanics of throwing a javelin is very different than throwing a baseball. There's similarities, but there are also a lot of differences. So that presented me with a question. When I have this person with shoulder pain, I had to ask, what muscles are used in throwing a javelin versus throwing a baseball. So, often these questions will come to you pretty easily because you know what you're kind of wanting to research, but sometimes they're not as easy. But we need to ask the question in a very specific way. And that's what I want to focus on here first, is what kind of question should you be asking and how do you structure a evidence-based practice question? So when you are presented with a challenge, a new client with a new goal or something, you obviously are going to ask yourself a bunch of questions to learn more about this topic or learn more about how you can help this individual. First questions you typically ask are background questions, like I just did about the javelin thrower. I may ask myself, how are the mechanics different for throwing a javelin versus throwing a baseball or hitting a volleyball? Those are general questions. Those are called background questions in the evidence-based practice framework. So background questions are general questions about the issue. If you have a bunch of athletes that are getting fatigued in their sport and your coach wants you to design a better program to prevent that, you might ask your questions like, what are the sources of fatigue for soccer athletes? Is it a nutritional issue? Is it a muscular endurance issue? Is it an aerobic capacity issue, etc.? We also might ask ourselves what methods could be used to prevent fatigue. So, if we think that it's a diet issue, it's how can we improve the athlete's diet, a college athlete's diet? What can we do to enhance that? If we think it's a muscular endurance issue, it might be what exercises can we use and what should those acute variables be for those exercise program to improve muscular endurance and sprint speed, etc. And then we also might have questions about how do we assess it? What is the appropriate way to assess fatigue resistance in soccer players? Is it a 2-mile run? Is it a sprint endurance test, etc.? So we need to understand, how can I assess this in this group of people? So those are general questions. Those aren't evidence-based practice questions yet. Those are good questions. They're kind of too general to give me a very specific answer that I need for this group of people. We need to ask much more specific questions so we can get specific recommendations on how we can apply this info to our athletes or our clients. Foreground questions are the hallmark of evidence-based practice. We have to write a specific question tailored to give me the information that I need. And to do that, we use a process or a type of question called a Pico question, or Pico parentheses T. We'll talk about what the T means and why it's optional and not always used. But basically, by following this framework for answering a question, it allows you to include the important aspects of your question. It also provides you with searchable terms that you can use in finding information about the topic. So a foreground question or a Pico question is the process that I want you to basically start with when you're asking these questions in an evidence-based practice model. So what is a Pico question? How do you use this to ask yourself a question that you can then research? Well, let's look at a couple examples here. You basically are going to fill in the blanks, right? Like if you have to identify these things related to your population, your client, right? So typically when you are doing this evidence-based practice, you have a person in mind or a group of people in mind. Maybe it's an athlete that has a particular goal. They want to improve this aspect of their performance. That will give you this information. The athlete. You will need to find out what the potential interventions are. You know what the comparison is. It might be treatment as usual or a standard program. You know what your outcome is. It's sprint speed or whatever the goal of your athlete was. And then you have a time frame maybe where you want that change to occur. So this is how you would, or a couple examples of how you would structure a question in an evidence-based practice exercise. So in the top one here, we see, if our goal is to try to prevent, injury or improve some aspect of function, you might start with a sentence like this where you fill in the blanks. If your goal is to, kind of look at the cause of disease or prevent disease, you could use something like this. So basically, you're going to throw in here who your population is, what your intervention is. Maybe your goal is to use instead of a normal endurance program, you want to use a high-intensity interval training program. So you would say your intervention is the high-intensity interval training program. Your comparison would be a standard, training program. And how it would influence is your outcome. So it might be sprint speed, right? So you fill in these blanks, and that will give you this type of a Pico question. Here's a couple examples. So if our goal is to look at, hey, someone comes to you and says, hey, I really like foam rolling. Can I use that to improve my range of motion? You may not know the answer to that. You don't know if foam rolling really works. It looks cool, seems fun, people like it, it's relaxing, but does it really improve recovery after exercise? Does it decrease muscle soreness as good as a standard program, which maybe is stretching? It's something you've used for a long time. So to do that, you would write this Pico question, and this is an athlete that's asking it. So in athletes, that's your population, does foam rolling, which is your intervention, compared to static stretching, which is your comparison treatment or group, influence recovery after exercise, which is your outcome? So you'd have to have, you're applying this to a group of athletes. You want to know if foam rolling is better or equal to or worse than static stretching in influencing recovery after exercise. That's how you write a Pico question. That one does not include a time frame. But you could include a time frame if you wanted, you could add over a 6-week training program, or during a preseason, session, whatever it might be. Etiology is another example where we can use a Pico question. In this case, I'm looking at more of a health promotion type situation. So maybe you want to know you're a wellness coach, and your facility is looking to provide free fitness center memberships to the workers at your organization. But you don't know if that's really going to be beneficial. Will that really give you the change that you're looking for? So here's a way that you could research that. You would write a Pico question where you say, our employees, which is your population, who have access to free fitness center memberships, which is your intervention, compared to those without free access, that would be maybe everybody before you got the free access. And are they at an increased risk or decreased risk of heart disease in their lifespan? So that would be your Pico question that you would then be able to gather data on, get information, and provide guidance to whether or not you should add this to your wellness program. So let's take a look at a specific example. A lot of times these evidence-based practice exercises that you conduct are because a client comes to you with a specific goal or question or, specific problem or issue, right? So here's an example. You have a 45-year-old client who asks for your advice on exercising and mental health. She's particularly interested in whether she'd gain any benefits for her depression from exercising. So she wants to know if exercise is going to benefit her mental health and wants to know a recommendation. So what do you have to do to research this question? We could go out and do a search on the internet and we'd find, yeah, it works great, right? But it would be a bunch of information that we can't necessarily count on as reliable. Plus, we want to look at the specifics here. We want to know depression, not just mental health. We also want to know exercise. does it help? But also, is there a particular type of exercise that would benefit her the most? And then we'd want to know what she's interested in as well. And also, maybe there's a difference in how exercise affects men versus women. So we also have to look specifically for women. So when we look at this question or this situation, we have to pull out the Pico information: population, intervention, comparison, outcome, and time frame, right? So we have to find the population. The population here, is she's a 45-year-old woman. If you do a search for 45-year-old women and stuff, you're not going to find it, right? But we probably want to go with older women, 40 mid-age or older, not kids. If possible. We want to look at an intervention. The intervention is exercise, which, she's kind of general. Will exercise help? But I would want to be more specific myself. I would want to know what type of exercise is best for improving depression symptoms, and specifically also factors such as how strenuous it is and so on. So is it resistance training? Is it low intensity, long duration, aerobic exercise or walking? Is it something, what's going to be best for her? Is it all exercise, or are there specific types that even have greater benefits? And then we need a comparison. What are we comparing it to? It sounds like she's not exercising per se, so maybe we want to know, compare it to no exercise. Also, maybe she's on antidepressants, or people are. Maybe we want to find out if it's better than being on antidepressants, or if it is something that works even better with antidepressants, and so on. And then finally, her outcome that she's looking for is improved depression symptoms, either reduced or completely eradicate these depression symptoms. So using that information, for the Pico, we could write a question that says, how does the use of exercise compared to no exercise or medication in treating depression in middle-aged women, right? That could be a type of a Pico question we could formulate based upon this client and what their goals are. In the next presentation, what I want to do is take a closer look at asking a question, because this really ends up being the biggest and part of evidence-based practice, is formulating a researchable, relevant question that we then search for answers for.